The judge looked at me and asked a single question that decided everything. If I was such a worthless husband, why was my name on financial records worth $8.7 million? I walked into the family courthouse in Denver that morning knowing I was already losing. Not because I had done anything wrong, but because the room had decided who I was before I ever opened my mouth. I could feel it in the air, heavy and cold, like the kind of silence that settles right before a storm breaks. The hallway smelled like old paper and burnt coffee. People passed by without looking at me, couples whispering, lawyers moving with purpose, clerks carrying folders thick enough to crush someone. I sat on a wooden bench outside the courtroom, hands folded, staring at a scuff mark on the floor. I had tied my shoes twice that morning, not because they were loose, but because I needed something small to control. When the doors opened, I stood and walked in alone. On the other side of the room sat Laura. She did not look at me. She was dressed like this was a job interview. Perfect posture, calm expression, hands folded neatly in front of her. Next to her sat her parents, Richard and Margaret Hale, straight-backed and composed. They looked like people who expected to win, because they always did. I took my seat at the defendant table. There was no one beside me. No comforting hand on my arm. No whispered reassurance. Just the quiet scrape of the chair as I sat down. The judge entered. Everyone stood. Everyone sat. Laura spoke first. She talked about stability, about responsibility, about what a child needed from a father. She said my work was inconsistent. She said I worked from home and did not have a real job. She said I did not contribute enough, financially or otherwise. She said she had carried our family while I drifted from project to project. Pretending that freedom was a career, her lawyer followed. He spoke slowly, confidently, like someone explaining something obvious to a child. He said I had no fixed salary. He said I could not guarantee the same paycheck every month. He said a man who could not guarantee that had no business asking for primary custody of a child. Then Richard stood up. He did not bother with politeness. He said I had never belonged in his family. He said I lacked ambition. He said I had relied on their support for years and had nothing real to show for it. He said the word worthless like it was a fact, not an insult. Margaret wiped her eyes and talked about how hard it had been for her daughter, how disappointed she had been watching Laura struggle with a husband who refused to grow up. She spoke softly, but every word landed hard. I felt eyes on me from every direction, some curious, some sympathetic, some already bored. I said nothing. Inside, my chest was tight. My heart beat hard against my ribs, but my face stayed still. I did not look at Laura. I did not look at Richard. I looked straight ahead, at the seal behind the judge, and waited. When it was my turn, the judge leaned forward slightly and asked about my finances. His voice was neutral, but I could hear the doubt beneath it. He asked how I intended to support my daughter without a stable income. I stood up. My hands trembled, just a little. I kept them at my sides. I said I had documents I wished to submit. Nothing more. A clerk took the folder from my hands. It was thick. He raised his eyebrows slightly before handing it to the judge. The judge opened it. At first, nothing changed. He flipped a page, then another. His face stayed serious, unreadable. Laura shifted in her seat. Richard crossed his arms. The judge kept reading. He paused. He went back a page, then forward again. The room was so quiet I could hear someone breathing behind me. The judge cleared his throat. He looked up at me, then back down at the papers. He asked for a short recess. Laura turned toward me for the first time. Her face had lost its color. We all stood again. The judge left. The room buzzed with whispers. But no one spoke to me. I sat back down and folded my hands. I thought about Emily. She was 10 years old. She liked pancakes on Saturdays and hated socks with seams. She fell asleep on the couch with a book in her lap and always pretended she was not tired. She was the reason I had stayed quiet for so long. When the judge returned, he did not sit right away. He adjusted his glasses and looked directly at Laura, then at me. He said the court had reviewed my submitted records. He said the numbers contradicted the claims made about my financial situation. He said my assets and income showed long-term stability, $8.7 million. The words landed like a dropped plate. Sharp, loud, impossible to ignore. Laura froze. Richard leaned forward, his jaw tight. Margaret stopped breathing. The judge said the narrative presented by the plaintiff did not align with the documented facts. He said custody would be reconsidered in light of this information. I sat down. I did not smile. I did not feel relief. What I felt was something closer to exhaustion. Like a weight I had been carrying for years had shifted, but not lifted. As the session ended, Laura whispered something to her lawyer. Richard stared at the table. Margaret looked straight ahead, her lips pressed together. I walked out of the courtroom alone again. But the air felt different, lighter, somehow. Or maybe I was just standing up straighter. Outside, the winter sun reflected off the concrete steps. I stood there for a moment, breathing in the cold, thinking about how quickly a room can turn on you, and how quickly it can turn back. Behind me, the doors closed. I did not know what would happen next. I only knew that the story they had told about me no longer fit. And that terrified them more than anything I could have said. The first time I realized how invisible I had become was years before that courtroom ever existed. It was a fall evening in 2011, Denver already cooling down after sunset, when Laura brought me to her parents' house for dinner. I remember standing at the door with a bottle of wine in my hand, rehearsing polite answers in my head like a teenager about to meet a principal. Richard Hale opened the door and sized me up in a single glance. Not rude, not friendly, just measuring. Dinner was formal without trying to be. Heavy table, heavy chairs, quiet clink of silverware. Margaret asked me where I grew up and nodded politely at my answers. Laura smiled too much, the way people do when they want everything to go smoothly. Richard asked me what I did for a living. I told him I worked as a financial consultant, independent, mostly project-based. I explained that I helped companies restructure cash flow, plan long-term investments, clean up problems they did not even realize they had yet. I said it calmly, confidently, because at the time, I was proud of what I did. He asked how much I made. I hesitated, then answered honestly. I said my income varied. Some months were quiet. Some months were heavy. I explained that over a year it balanced out. He did not ask what that balance was. He asked how much I made per month. When I said it did not really work that way, something shifted in his face, just slightly. The rest of the night went on, but I was no longer a guest. I was a question mark. Laura defended me that night. She said I was smart, that I had potential, that independence mattered. Richard smiled and said potential was not the same as stability. I did not argue. I told myself it did not matter. After we got married, it mattered more than I expected. The house we moved into sat in a quiet suburb outside Denver. The down payment came from Laura's parents. It was framed as help. Temporary, no strings attached. I thanked them. Richard nodded like he had confirmed something he already believed. Every major decision after that seemed to happen without me. Renovations were discussed between Laura and her parents. School options were debated at family dinners where I was present but never consulted. When Emily was born, Richard talked about college savings before we even left the hospital. I paid our bills. I covered groceries. I handled insurance and utilities. I quietly invested my income. But none of that counted because it did not come with a pay stub on the first of the month. In 2018, Richard's logistics company hit a wall. A supplier collapsed. Cash flow tightened. Panic spread quietly through the management team. Laura came home tense, talking about her father's stress, about meetings that ran late into the night. One evening, she asked if I could take a look at some numbers, just to give an opinion. I did more than that. I spent a weekend reviewing projections, restructuring debt schedules, mapping out a recovery plan that would keep the company solvent without layoffs. I walked Richard through it step by step. He listened. He implemented it. The company survived. At the next family gathering, someone toasted Richard's leadership. Margaret beamed. Laura squeezed my hand under the table. Grateful. No one mentioned my name. I told myself it did not matter. I told myself I was doing this for my family, not recognition.